In the stillness of the early morning, a quiet residential street in North Carolina lay undisturbed. Streetlights cast long shadows across trimmed lawns and parked cars. The kind of neighborhood where people didn't lock their doors until something gave them a reason to. That reason came abruptly, with one call that shattered the silence. At precisely 1:10 a.m., emergency dispatchers received a phone call that started without panic, but with something more unsettling: confusion. A man's voice, low and almost slurred, came through the line. He wasn't screaming, he wasn't even crying. He was trying to explain something that, even to him, didn't make sense. "There's blood," the voice said. I think I may have killed my wife." Emergency services were immediately dispatched to the address. The man identified himself as Matthew Phelps, a 28-year-old former Bible college student. His voice was unsteady, not in the way someone breaks under grief, but as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality, what he remembered and what lay in front of him. When first responders entered the home, the scene they encountered was brutal, unexpected, and deeply disturbing. In the dim light of the living room, they found Lauren Phelps, 29, lying motionless on the floor, her body soaked in blood. Paramedics attempted life-saving measures, but it was immediately clear the wounds were far beyond recovery. She had been stabbed multiple times, later confirmed to be over 100. The floor was smeared with blood. Nearby furniture had flecks of red, though oddly, there were no signs of a struggle, no overturned chairs, no broken objects. The knife, a standard kitchen blade, lay beside her, coated entirely in red. Lauren's face was pale, almost gray. Her arms were partially raised, suggesting a late attempt to shield herself. Her phone was on the coffee table, untouched. The TV had been left on mute. Her slippers were neatly aligned by the staircase. Everything looked eerily undisturbed, except her. Matthew was seated on the couch, his clothes stained, his hands visibly trembling. He did not flee. He did not resist arrest. He did not deny anything, but his words remained vague. He told police he had taken a dose of coricidin, a common over-the-counter cold medicine. According to him, he had trouble sleeping. He had taken more than recommended, hoping to feel better, and then at some point blacked out. When he awoke, Lauren was lying on the floor in blood. He didn't remember the attack. He didn't remember the knife. He only remembered waking up and seeing the aftermath. The officers did not speak. Their training didn't allow them the luxury of reacting emotionally. But they noted the details: the position of the body, the lack of visible hesitation wounds, the depth of the stabs, and most of all, they noted the precision. These were not the erratic flailings of someone disoriented. These were deliberate, repeated, and concentrated wounds. Neighbors were awakened by flashing lights and muffled radios. Most were confused. Some watched silently from their porches. No one expected violence from that house, from that couple. Lauren was known to be kind, upbeat, and deeply committed to her church community. She worked at a local Christian bookstore and was described by friends as the kind of person who remembered birthdays and asked how you were doing, and meant it. Matthew had studied at a theological seminary, though he was no longer attending. He had held a few jobs, but none steady. The couple had been married less than a year. There had been no prior reports of domestic violence, no warning signs to outsiders, but law enforcement knew better. They knew appearances lied. They knew there was no such thing as a murder without context, only murders without context, yet revealed. Investigators secured the home and began to catalog the scene. The knife would be taken in for analysis. Blood patterns, footprints, and residual DNA swabs would follow. But the most immediate observation wasn't forensic. It was psychological. The man who had called 911 had not sounded frantic or broken. He had sounded detached. His voice wavered, but it lacked urgency. He had called not because he was desperate to save her, but because he didn't know what else to do. It was too soon to draw conclusions. They had a suspect, but not a confession. A crime scene, but not a motive. A husband, but possibly not a killer, or at least not in the way he claimed. But what they did have was a body. A young woman brutally killed in her own home by someone who was either too unstable to remember or too manipulative to admit. As the coroner arrived and the house was cordoned off, one investigator quietly walked through the hallway leading to the bedroom. He paused at a photo on the wall, Lauren and Matthew on their wedding day, smiling in sunlight. It had been taken just months earlier. Back then, no one knew what was coming. But now, the photo felt almost cruel. a silent witness to a love story that hadn't just ended. It had exploded. The investigation had just begun. But even in these early hours, it was clear this case would not be easy. Not because the suspect was unknown, but because the truth, whatever it was, had been buried under layers of domestic normalcy, blurred memory, and a silence that spoke too loudly. This wasn't just a murder, it was a collapse, from the inside, and someone would have to dig through the wreckage. It is often after the violence that the narrative takes shape. Before the crime, people move through their lives unnoticed, ordinary, predictable. It is only once tragedy strikes that those around them begin to retrace every step, every conversation, searching for meaning in moments that once seemed mundane. In the days that followed the early morning 911 call, Lauren Phelps was no longer just another name in a quiet neighborhood. She became the center of a spiraling question. How does someone like her end up like this? Lauren was not invisible. She was, in fact, known, at least in the ways most people are in their community. She worked at a Christian bookstore, regularly attended church, and volunteered at youth ministry events. She was described as gentle but assertive, socially warm yet private when it came to personal matters. Those who knew her recalled a woman who smiled often, who made time to check in on others, and who wrote handwritten notes on holidays. But for all her outward warmth, very few people seemed to know the full extent of her inner life. There were glimpses. One friend remembered a conversation weeks prior, during which Lauren had spoken vaguely about feeling tired, not just physically but emotionally. She hadn't elaborated. It hadn't raised alarms at the time. In retrospect, it was haunting. Her social media accounts were modest, photos of coffee mugs, worship nights, snapshots of her dog. Nothing dramatic, nothing erratic, nothing that foretold the kind of violence that would end her life. But that, in itself, was the first red flag. There was a quietness to her digital presence, and a kind of restraint that suggested she wasn't using those platforms for expression. She was using them as a filter. Interviews with family painted a picture of a woman who had always tried to do the right thing. Raised in a religious household, Lauren had internalized the values of patience, loyalty, and compromise. She met her husband through mutual acquaintances in church circles, and by most accounts, theirs had been a whirlwind romance, engaged quickly, married within a year. From the outside, it looked like a picture-perfect Christian relationship. But perfection has always been a dangerous disguise. Their wedding photos told a story the investigation was determined to unravel. Smiles, matching outfits, scripted vows, every detail meticulously arranged. But the people in those photos no longer existed. They had been replaced by a reality no one saw coming. The coroner's report had barely been filed, and yet investigators were already looking beyond the night of the murder. The key to understanding what happened would not be found in the blood on the floor. It would be found in the days and months that led up to it. And that meant understanding Lauren, not just as a victim, but as a person navigating a world that might have slowly been closing in on her. One of the most unsettling aspects of cases like these is the distance between what people show and what they endure. Lauren was not someone who would air grievances in public. She was not the type to dramatize. Instead, she held things in, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps out of hope that they would change. Investigators learned that she had, on at least 2 occasions, looked into marriage counseling. Once she had even scheduled a session, but she had canceled it, telling the counselor it wasn't the right time. Friends said she had become quieter in recent months, not withdrawn, but edited, selective with what she shared. One close acquaintance described it as a kind of hesitation, like she was trying not to say too much. Another recalled a comment Lauren had made during a casual conversation. Sometimes you don't realize how tired you are until you stop pretending you're fine. At the time, it had passed as a passing remark. Now, it felt like a silent cry for help. Police followed every thread. They went through her emails, text messages, and search history. While there were no overt threats, there were patterns, searches for how to cope with controlling behavior, forum visits on relationship manipulation, and even links saved about emotional abuse in marriage. She had not spoken these words out loud, but she had typed them, quietly, privately, into the search bar of a device no one else had access to. What stood out wasn't just the nature of the questions, but the way they were phrased, not accusatory, not dramatic, always in the tone of someone blaming themselves first. Is it my fault my partner gets upset easily? How to know if I'm overreacting in a marriage? These were not the words of someone looking for a way out. They were the words of someone still hoping for a way forward. This wasn't about painting Lauren as a saint. She was human, capable of anger, frustration, missteps like anyone else. But she was also someone trying to hold together something that may have been unraveling from the moment it began. And that effort, quiet, invisible, unrewarded, was now a central piece of the investigation. Law enforcement had seen this before, victims who stayed silent, who smiled in public, who made excuses in private. It was rarely about weakness. More often, it was about belief. The belief that things could get better, that people could change, that love could heal. But love, when one-sided, can become a burden. And burdens, when carried alone for too long, can become fatal. As detectives built their timeline, they started to see what Lauren might have seen. The moments of tension that no one else witnessed, the offhand comments that chipped away at her confidence, the subtle, creeping erosion of independence that often comes before something breaks entirely. In conversations with those closest to her, there was a recurring theme. We never imagined something like this. That sentence would come up over and over, not because people missed obvious signs, but because the signs were never loud. They were buried in politeness, masked by smiles, softened by loyalty. Lauren Phelps was not a woman forgotten. She was a woman unseen until it was too late. The initial interrogation took place in a controlled, sterile room, devoid of distraction and intentionally devoid of comfort. A single table, 2 chairs, fluorescent lighting that cast no shadows. It was the kind of setting designed not to intimidate, but to expose. In such environments, truth, or at least the cracks in a lie, tend to reveal themselves not in grand confessions, but in the hesitations, inconsistencies, and omissions that accumulate slowly, like sediment at the bottom of a slow-moving current. Sitting across from the detectives was the man who had made the 911 call just hours earlier. He was pale, slouched, and wore the same clothes from that night, stained, wrinkled, soaked in dried blood. There was no demand for a lawyer, no insistence on innocence. Instead, there was a subdued resignation in his posture, as though the weight of the previous night had not just physically drained him, but severed him from any connection to reality. His statement began not with facts, but with confusion. He told investigators that he hadn't meant to hurt anyone. He said he had trouble sleeping. He mentioned taking medication, cold medicine, Coricidin HBP to be specific. He had used it before, occasionally, to help him sleep when stress or racing thoughts kept him awake, but this time, he said, something went wrong. He claimed to have taken more than the recommended dosage, not with the intent to harm, but to rest. That was his word, rest. He said he remembered going to bed. He said he remembered feeling distant, heavy. After that, he claimed there was nothing, no struggle, no fight, no sound, just a gap in time, and then waking up to a scene that made no sense. Blood, her body, the knife, the 911 call. A night turned into aftermath without explanation. To a layperson, such a statement might carry the strange weight of possibility. After all, there are documented instances, though rare, where medications, particularly in high doses, have been linked to sleepwalking or dissociative states. But to trained investigators, his account triggered a different kind of scrutiny. They had seen this defense before, the implication that something other than intent was responsible, that the mind had been hijacked by chemistry, that a person's actions no longer belonged to them. But here, context mattered. Investigators began cross-referencing his claims with everything they had gathered from the crime scene: the position of the body, the depth and frequency of the wounds, the lack of hesitation marks, the absence of any defensive injuries on the suspect, the kitchen drawer from which the knife was taken, the patterns of blood spatter, the time gap between the estimated moment of death and the 911 call. None of it supported the idea of a confused or unconscious actor. This was not the scene of a single impulsive action. It was prolonged, repetitive, deliberate. The injuries had been inflicted in a manner that indicated escalation, not accident, not sleepwalking, and certainly not the disoriented chaos often found in crimes committed under hallucinogenic states. There was no overturned furniture, no broken objects, no evidence that Lauren had attempted to flee. Her wounds were consistent with someone being attacked while in a vulnerable position, likely seated or kneeling. This painted a very different picture from the one being described by the man in the interrogation chair. Still, investigators did not rush to confront him. They let the silence stretch between questions. They allowed him to fill the space, which he did, slowly, cautiously, offering information without prompting. Information that, as it turned out, would complicate his own narrative. He mentioned that he and Lauren had been arguing more frequently, that money was tight, that he felt pressure, that he sometimes wondered if she would leave him. He didn't say these things as if trying to justify his actions. He spoke them like observations detached from consequence. And then, almost as an afterthought, he spoke about a film. He had watched it multiple times, he said. American Psycho. A character study, he called it. He said he admired the way it was shot, the psychological depth of it, the aesthetic. This reference, though seemingly tangential, set off alarm bells. Not because watching violent films makes someone violent, but because of what it revealed about his internal narrative, what kind of material resonated with him, what ideas he found compelling. The protagonist of American Psycho is a man who hides behind charm, uses emotional detachment as armor, and ultimately collapses under the weight of his own delusions. For a suspect to casually bring up that film in this context was more than troubling. It was a thematic mirror. Investigators requested a forensic review of his personal devices. They found more than just movie clips. They found notes, digital journals, online searches that included keywords like how to fake sleepwalking, can cold medicine cause violence, and temporary insanity defense in North Carolina. The timestamps notably preceded the crime. What emerged was a portrait of a man who had not lost control, but who may have been looking for a way to appear as though he had. The idea of involuntary action, the so-called automatism defense, requires very specific conditions to be credible. No prior intent, no planning, a sudden unforeseeable episode of dissociation or sleep behavior. What they were now seeing contradicted all of that. Still, the man in the chair insisted he didn't remember the act. But memory, in criminal investigations, is not always the foundation for guilt or innocence. What matters more is the physical evidence, the record that cannot be rewritten. The knife had only one set of prints. The blood on his clothing showed patterns consistent with close-range force. There were no signs of forced entry, no third-party DNA. The story being told by the forensic evidence was clear, even if the suspect's version remained blurred. Outside the interview room, Lauren's parents were still trying to make sense of what had happened. Her father refused to speak to the press. Her mother, holding a framed photo of her daughter, spoke only one sentence. She never believed it would get this bad. That belief, that things could be managed, forgiven, endured, is a recurring tragedy in domestic homicide cases. Victims rarely believe they are in danger until it's too late. Often they are conditioned to hope, to adjust, to avoid conflict, rather than confront it. Lauren had no criminal protective orders, no police reports, no documented history of abuse. But now all of that felt irrelevant. The night she died became the only entry that mattered. As investigators prepared to present their findings to the prosecution, they knew that public reaction would be divided. There would be those who viewed the suspect as mentally unstable, others who saw calculated intent. But their job wasn't to speculate. Their job was to build a case on evidence, and that case was taking shape, slowly, meticulously, through hours of analysis and cross-reference details. Whether or not the suspect remembered what he did, the law would not forget. The first and most sobering truths in any homicide investigation are not spoken aloud. They are recorded in silence on cold steel examination tables under the unflinching lights of a coroner's suite. The dead do not lie. They reveal, in wounds and blood and broken skin, what others attempt to conceal. When Lauren Phelps' body arrived for forensic autopsy, the medical examiner approached with the same procedural discipline required for every case, regardless of circumstance. But the moment the sheet was pulled back, the gravity of what had occurred became impossible to ignore. This was not a spontaneous attack. This was not a momentary lapse. This was sustained violence, executed with force and terrifying precision. Lauren had been stabbed 123 times. Each wound was documented, each angle, depth, and location meticulously recorded. Most were concentrated in the neck and upper torso, specifically the chest, shoulders, and arms. Defensive injuries were present on her hands and forearms, indicating that she had tried to protect herself. She had not gone quietly. She had resisted. She had fought back, but she was outmatched. What the examiner found most telling was the nature of the injuries. These were not wild or erratic strikes, typical of a panicked or frenzied state. The pattern suggested escalation, Multiple wounds to the same areas inflicted with sustained aggression, not random bursts. Some cuts were deep and forceful, likely driven with full body weight. Others were more superficial, perhaps delivered as she tried to escape or shield herself. The final wound, believed to be fatal, was a deep stab to the left side of her neck, severing major arteries. According to the pathologist's report, death would not have been instantaneous. It was likely that Lauren was conscious during much of the assault, experiencing pain, fear, and confusion until her body could no longer sustain the trauma. Autopsy photographs were taken, as required. They would never be shown to the public, but they would become a permanent part of the evidence file, a silent record of what one person endured at the hands of another. For investigators, the medical findings confirmed what the crime scene had already hinted at. This was not an act committed in sleep or while unaware. It was too deliberate, too focused, too long-lasting. The coroner estimated that the attack spanned at least 2 to 4 minutes of continuous stabbing. In forensic terms, that is an eternity. Long enough to realize what is happening. Long enough to stop. Toxicology screens on Lauren returned normal. No drugs, no alcohol, nothing in her system that might have impaired her ability to respond or defend herself. She was healthy, alert, aware. That only amplified the horror. She had not stumbled unknowingly into danger. She had been present for every second of it. The autopsy also revealed bruising on her upper arms, suggestive of restraint. Investigators compared those marks with the suspect's hand size and later confirmed that the grip impressions were consistent. Lauren had likely been pinned or held down at various points during the assault. Crime scene photos paired with the medical report painted a deeply disturbing image. Blood had soaked through the carpet and into the subfloor. Cast-off patterns on the nearby walls suggested a raised and lowered blade, repeated with rhythm and speed. Analysts used software to reconstruct the probable movement of the weapon, mapping out an arc of motion that remained remarkably consistent. This was not the chaotic flailing of a confused individual. This was a calculated act sustained through multiple, uninterrupted sequences. Forensic teams also examined the knife. It was taken from a block in the kitchen, part of a common household set. The blade was 8 inches in length, stainless steel, with a plastic handle. Fingerprint analysis confirmed a single set of prints on the grip. No gloves, no attempt to obscure identity. The suspect's blood was not present, indicating that he had not been injured during the assault, which further discredited claims of unconsciousness or confusion. In sleepwalking or chemically induced states, individuals frequently injure themselves unintentionally. That was not the case here. Beyond the physical evidence, the emotional and symbolic weight of the crime began to take root in the minds of those working it. One detective, a veteran of domestic violence cases, remarked off-record that the sheer number of wounds seemed to go beyond murder. It felt like annihilation. It suggested an intent not only to kill, but to erase, to destroy someone, not merely end their life. Such overkill is rare in random or passionless homicides. It is most often seen in cases involving personal relationships where rage has festered over time. Control, resentment, and suppressed hostility often precede this level of violence. And yet the most chilling part of this particular case was that no prior domestic violence reports existed. No 911 calls, no documented threats. On paper, the relationship had been unremarkable, but the body told a different story. Investigators, informed by trauma experts, began to reassess how danger manifests in relationships that appear stable on the surface. Lauren's wounds weren't just physical. They represented a collapse of trust, of perceived safety, of personal agency. The betrayal was not merely that of a partner turning violent, but that of a reality being shattered from within. Her parents were brought in to identify her body. The process was handled with as much care as possible, but there is no gentle way to ask a mother to confirm that her daughter has been mutilated. Her father did not speak. He remained silent, jaw clenched, hands locked behind his back, eyes fixed on the wall. Her mother wept. Not the kind of weeping that comes in waves, but the broken, soundless grief that floods all at once and leaves a person hollow. In the days following the autopsy, law enforcement began assembling their final report. The crime scene analysis, the medical examiner's conclusions, and the physical evidence were being compiled into a cohesive narrative for the prosecution. The suspect's statement about not remembering the act had already begun to unravel. Now it stood in direct conflict with the forensic reality. To forget is one thing, but to create a scene like this and to claim no memory was a contradiction too large to ignore. In legal terms, the evidence did not require confession. The body itself had spoken. It had delivered a testimony that could not be withdrawn, altered, or misunderstood. The question moving forward would not be whether the suspect committed the crime. It would be why, and whether that why mattered in the eyes of the law. Every homicide leaves behind more than just a crime scene. It leaves traces of its origin, scattered across the mundane details of daily life. Messages half sent, calls unanswered, subtle withdrawals from routines once comforting. In the case of Lauren Phelps, understanding her death meant going far beyond the autopsy report or the bloodied floor of a quiet home. It meant returning to the fragile weeks before her final breath, a period during which patterns of psychological erosion quietly intensified beneath the surface of normalcy. In the days following the autopsy, digital forensic analysts began examining the contents of Lauren's and her husband's phones, laptops, and online accounts. What they unearthed was not a singular revelation, but a breadcrumb trail, small, isolated signals of emotional distress and relationship tension that, taken together, built a deeply troubling portrait of a woman silently navigating the periphery of control, conflict, and eroding autonomy. Lauren's phone held thousands of texts, but investigators honed in on exchanges with a small group of close friends. These messages did not scream danger. They were measured, hesitant, and laced with just enough ambiguity to mask the severity of her concerns. In one thread, she joked about living with a grump, and in another, she mentioned walking on eggshells lately. None of the comments explicitly stated abuse or fear, but when viewed in context, especially against the backdrop of what happened, they became signals that something had shifted. What stood out most were the subtle indicators of self-doubt. Lauren repeatedly questioned her own reactions, often framing her unease as oversensitivity. "Maybe I'm just taking things too personally," she texted a friend. "I get the feeling he's frustrated, but I can't always tell what I'm doing wrong." These weren't the words of someone seeking help. They were the words of someone still trying to take responsibility for the instability of someone else. The couple's shared calendar app showed a marked decline in social activities leading up to the murder. Regular visits with friends had stopped. Church attendance, once consistent, had become sporadic. Invitations to group events had been left unanswered. Friends had assumed they were just busy, or maybe adjusting to married life. But behind that assumption was an increasing isolation, one that Lauren did not vocalize, but seemed to accept as inevitable. Bank statements revealed mounting financial pressure. Credit card balances were rising, and several recurring transactions indicated purchases made on collectible items and digital content unrelated to household needs. Lauren's own spending had remained minimal. The imbalance suggested a relationship dynamic in which one partner exerted economic influence, even if not outright control. She had not opened a separate account. She had not changed passwords. She had not left. What drew particular attention was a draft email found in her account, never sent. It was addressed to a local counselor. The subject line read simply, "Need advice." The body of the message detailed feelings of being trapped in a loop, where arguments ended not with resolution but with silence. She described moments where she felt more like a house guest than a partner, and ended with a chilling line, "Sometimes I feel like I'm being erased, one choice at a time." The email had been saved 3 days before she died. Investigators began mapping the couple's final week in detail. They obtained security camera footage from a neighbor's front porch, which showed Lauren returning home on the evening of the attack, alone and carrying a takeout bag. There was no visible tension, no argument caught on audio. The door closed behind her, nothing more. But the digital data told a fuller story. That evening, her phone registered a series of unsent text messages. One, addressed to her sister, read, "Do you ever feel like you don't know the person you're living with?" It had been typed, then deleted. Another message, addressed to a friend, read, "If something happens, I just want you to know." But it, too, had been left unfinished. The cursor had blinked. The thought had been abandoned. Whether out of second-guessing or fear, Lauren never pressed send. Psychological autopsies, retrospective reconstructions of a victim's mental and emotional state, are not often discussed outside investigative circles. But in cases like this, they are essential. What Lauren's behavior revealed was a classic but often misunderstood dynamic, the erosion of self through sustained emotional manipulation. No violence had ever been reported, no visible bruises, but the psychological architecture of control had taken root, subtle, normalized, and dangerous. Her withdrawal wasn't passive, it was protective. But without support, without naming what was happening, without a clear sense of validation, it remained invisible. Those around her interpreted her quiet as adjustment, as personality, as privacy. And like so many before her, Lauren bore the burden of navigating a deteriorating emotional landscape without making anyone else uncomfortable. Interviews with her friends in the aftermath were heartbreaking in their consistency. Every one of them said the same thing: "I wish I'd asked more questions." Not because they ignored red flags, but because the signs had been camouflaged as part of a polite conflict-avoidant persona. Lauren didn't want to be a problem. She didn't want to disrupt. And in that silence, danger was allowed to grow unchecked. The suspect's digital activity during the same period added further layers to the emerging narrative. Search histories included entries like how to get out of debt without telling your spouse, how to make your partner listen, and sleep aids that don't show up on tests. None of these were incriminating in isolation, but their timing, frequency, and proximity to the crime contributed to a timeline in which tension had reached a boiling point. He had not snapped in an instant. Something had been building. When the data was compiled, investigators began assembling a psychological profile, not only of the victim, but of the relationship itself. It became increasingly clear that the home in which Lauren lived was not the sanctuary it appeared to be. It had become a closed loop, where miscommunication turned into emotional drift, and where resentment slowly replaced empathy. The danger wasn't that no one knew, it was that no one had been told. By the end of the week, investigators presented a detailed report outlining the timeline of the couple's final days. It was not just a schedule of events, it was a slow, granular unraveling of a relationship that had lost its center. There was no single trigger, no explosive fight, just a quiet descent into something dark, familiar to those who study coercive control, but nearly impossible to intervene in without disclosure. Lauren Phelps never screamed for help. She never filed a complaint. She never told anyone she was afraid. And that, perhaps, is what makes her story so devastating. Not only was she taken violently, but she had been slipping away, emotionally and psychologically, long before that night. She had faded from view in plain sight. Control, when it enters a relationship, rarely arrives with fanfare. It doesn't announce itself as abuse. It doesn't bruise the skin on day one. It starts as subtle shifts, compromises framed as care, preferences disguised as protection, and eventually decisions no longer made jointly, but delivered as expectation. In Lauren's case, by the time the signs became visible in hindsight, the damage had already been done, incrementally, consistently, invisibly. As investigators expanded their scope beyond the immediate incident, they began examining the relationship dynamics from a psychological framework. The term they kept returning to was coercive control, a form of emotional and behavioral manipulation designed to dominate a partner's autonomy. This wasn't speculation. It was evidenced in Lauren's digital footprint, behavioral changes, and the testimony of those who watched her slowly withdraw from the life she once inhabited fully. A pattern had emerged. In the early months of marriage, Lauren had been socially active, engaged in her church community, and regularly in touch with friends. She had volunteered for events, coordinated youth ministry trips, and maintained regular check-ins with her family. But over time, her digital activity narrowed, her online interactions thinned, and even her most trusted friendships saw a shift in tone. Her replies became shorter, more guarded. Photos once shared weekly slowed to a halt. Texts previously filled with lightness took on a mechanical tone, like obligations rather than conversation. Experts in the field of domestic violence often note that coercive control is more difficult to identify than physical violence because it's designed to evade detection. It functions through erosion rather than impact. It wears down a person's sense of independence, their self-worth, and eventually their ability to determine whether what they're experiencing is normal or dangerous. Lauren's search history mirrored the spiral. Investigators discovered dozens of visits to forums and articles focused on how to know if a relationship is toxic, how to talk to your partner about emotional distance, and am I overreacting to red flags? What made these searches especially painful was their tone, seeking clarity, not escape. She wasn't preparing to leave. She was still trying to make sense of what was happening. Her journal, recovered from a drawer in her nightstand, provided even deeper insight. In a neat, careful script, Lauren had recorded personal reflections, never meant to be read by anyone else. Some entries were optimistic, expressions of hope that things might get better. Others, more frequent in the final months, expressed confusion and self-doubt. "He used to laugh at my jokes," one line read. "Now I'm afraid to speak first at dinner." In another entry, "I keep thinking I'm making him angry without realizing it. I don't know what I've done wrong." It's a misconception that people in controlling relationships are unaware of their circumstances. Many, like Lauren, sense the imbalance but internalize the blame. When manipulation is subtle, cloaked in charm, or framed as concern, victims often question their own perceptions before questioning the intentions of the person they love. Investigators interviewed several of Lauren's closest confidants. One of her friends described a slow, steady change. "At first, it was just that she started canceling plans more often," the friend explained. "Then she stopped suggesting hangouts at all, and when we did meet up, she seemed distracted, like she was constantly checking the clock." These weren't sudden disappearances from her social life. They were minor shifts, easy to rationalize. But collectively, they pointed to a woman being nudged into isolation. Another red flag surfaced in the couple's home life. According to Lauren's parents, she had stopped visiting alone. Every family gathering or holiday, she brought her husband. While this might seem benign, it was a notable shift for someone who used to travel independently. Family members recalled moments when Lauren appeared overly cautious, especially when speaking about anything that might be interpreted as critical of her partner. At the time, they saw it as nervousness, perhaps new marriage jitters. In retrospect, it was something else. Surveillance through proximity. Control often cloaks itself in togetherness. But real closeness allows space. It doesn't surveil. It doesn't correct over casual remarks or punish perceived slights with coldness or silence. What Lauren endured was not a loss of affection. It was the replacement of affection with performance. A constant unspoken demand that she not disrupt the emotional equilibrium of her partner, no matter the cost to herself. Professionals reviewing the case noted parallels to other high-profile domestic violence cases. In many of them, there had been no physical abuse prior to the fatal event. Instead, the danger built in the background, a slow compression of the victim's world until escape became either too complicated or too abstract to envision. Lauren, like many victims of coercive control, didn't stay because she was weak. She stayed because she was still trying to fix things. She believed, as many do, that change was possible, that love could outlast control, and that belief, as sincere and hopeful as it was, became the very thing that allowed the pattern to persist. Interviews with behavioral psychologists brought sobering clarity. One expert explained that in emotionally manipulative dynamics, the abuser does not always see themselves as abusive. Instead, they rationalize their actions as justified responses to perceived disrespect or lack of loyalty. "It's not just about control," the expert said. "It's about entitlement. The belief that their partner exists to fulfill a role, and when that role isn't performed to expectation, punishment follows." This insight proved chilling when aligned with the suspect's earlier statements. During interviews, he had expressed frustration, not with Lauren's behavior but with his own sense of failure, loss of employment, financial strain, a sense of inferiority. These internal pressures, when unresolved, often spill into the dynamics of a relationship. But rather than seek support or accountability, the anger is redirected toward the person closest, most available, and least likely to fight back. The case, by this stage, had shifted from a procedural investigation to a broader exploration of psychological motive. The question was no longer simply what happened, but what made it possible. How does someone end up so thoroughly dominated that their death comes not with a public warning, but in the quiet of their own home, behind a locked door, in the arms of someone they once trusted? In Lauren's case, there was no grand reveal, no shocking revelation of secret abuse. Instead, there was an accumulation of overlooked moments, each one small enough to excuse, but together forming a system of control that had become her daily reality. When criminal behavior breaks into the realm of lethal violence, investigators look not only at the act itself, but at the belief systems, patterns, and internal justifications that may have built the foundation for such a rupture. The public often imagines murder as a sudden snap, a moment of uncontrolled rage or delusion. But in reality, especially in domestic homicides, the final act is frequently the endpoint of a long trajectory, lined with choices, signs, and symptoms that were never confronted. In the months before Lauren Phelps was killed, her husband's digital life offered a disturbing look into the disintegration of empathy and the escalation of obsession. His social media history, browser activity, and saved content created a psychological map, one where fantasy, frustration, and control began to converge. Investigators uncovered a pattern of late-night YouTube viewing, violent film scenes, true crime recreations, and amateur fan edits of infamous killers portrayed in cinema. One title appeared repeatedly, American Psycho. The film's central character, a well-dressed sociopath who commits murder with cold detachment, became a recurring motif across multiple platforms used by the suspect. He had saved quotes, collected images, and shared fan content that glamorized the aesthetic of control and emotional detachment. The film alone wasn't incriminating. Many people watch and discuss violent media without committing any acts of aggression, but when paired with real-world behavior, emotional withdrawal, financial irresponsibility, coercive patterns, and escalating resentment, it raised serious concerns, especially considering how often he referenced it in messages, including one chilling remark to a friend. Sometimes I wonder what it would feel like to live without guilt, to really live free. Digital forensics also revealed search terms such as how to kill without leaving evidence, what do psychopathic killers feel, and can murder be forgiven by God? These were not idle curiosities. The timestamps placed them days, sometimes hours before the murder. One note found in the phone's drafts read, "I don't want to be trapped. This life feels like a cage and I don't want to die in it." Investigators saw this not as a suicidal ideation, but as the internal language of someone building a moral rationale for destruction. The portrait that emerged was one of self-pity masked as philosophical questioning, a man beginning to see himself as a victim of his own decisions, slowly justifying extreme action as an act of liberation from perceived failure. By the time the forensic evidence and psychological profile were complete, the prosecution had everything it needed. There was no plausible claim of temporary insanity, no credible evidence of involuntary action. The knife bore his fingerprints alone. The blood spatter patterns matched his height, reach, and motion. The 911 call had been delayed. The attempt to blame cough medicine fell apart under medical scrutiny. The case went to trial quietly but quickly. The defense made no real attempt to deny the act, focusing instead on mitigating the sentence. They argued psychological distress, emotional instability, a fragile mental state worsened by over-the-counter substances, and deep spiritual confusion. But no jury could reconcile that argument with the facts. 123 stab wounds, an emotionally isolated victim, digital evidence of planning, and a complete lack of remorse at the time of the killing. Lauren's family sat through every day of the trial, listening in silence. Her mother held her daughter's Bible in her lap. Her father stared straight ahead, face unmoving. When the verdict came, it was unanimous. Guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. Outside the courtroom, Lauren's sister addressed the press. She didn't speak of revenge or anger. Instead, she spoke about silence, the silence Lauren had lived in, and the silence she hoped other women would one day break. "If you ever feel small in your own life," she said, "if you ever feel erased by someone who says they love you, please tell someone, even if you're not sure, even if it doesn't sound bad enough. Say it anyway." Lauren Phelps did not die in a moment. She disappeared in pieces, through isolation, subtle control, diminishing joy, and ultimately a final act of unforgivable violence. Her story was not about a monster hiding in the shadows. It was about someone already sitting at the table, someone with a smile, someone who said the right things until he didn't. The aftermath of her death prompted renewed community efforts on domestic violence awareness. Her friends organized a scholarship in her name for women seeking counseling or support during emotionally abusive relationships. Her church created a confidential outreach program for those unsure whether what they were experiencing was control or care. But justice, as it is measured in courtrooms, will never be enough to balance the scale of what was taken from Lauren. The truth is that the justice system can punish, but it cannot restore. It cannot go back and interrupt the moment when she chose not to press send on that final text. It cannot rewind time and fill in the space where a friend could have asked just one more question, or where a subtle shift in tone might have been seen for what it was, a call for help. In the end, what remains is a story. One with warnings, one with patterns, one with a name that should not be forgotten: Lauren Phelps.